Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Thursday noon keynote. Today it was with Shea Swauger, who is the department head, Research Support Services, University of Colorado, Denver, Aurora Library. And being a UCD doctoral student myself, when just reading off Aurora campus, it's like I'm nostalgic. Aurora campus. I remember what that was like. Oh, that was kind of like a whole an academic home to me. But if you're like me, you've been locked in for a while, and um, it's a great day to talk about the topic that Shea chose, which is the prison to school pipeline of EdTech. I know, controversial topic, title, but I've heard him speak before, and he is wonderful. So I'm going to turn it over to him and thank him so much for doing this with us.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm incredibly excited to be here. I've been following the conference and it's incredibly interesting. You guys are saying really good stuff. And yeah, I'm just happy to be among you all and learn with you. I'm going to go ahead and do a screen share to dive into the presentation. If there are questions, thanks for yeah, I'm very excited about my plans too. If there are questions that come up, I probably won't be personally monitoring the chat, but someone will. And if we need to go back, if we want to dig in to issues as we're talking through them, that's totally fine. So go ahead and throw those in the chat, and we can have a conversation. We'll also have a little bit of time at the end to go back and forth. I'd love to hear what you think and your ideas on this. So, I will be sending the PowerPoint out via tweet afterwards. I didn't get all my citations done in time, so I don't want to put something out there without robust citation, but there will be a copy of the PowerPoint out that I'm sure we can get to everybody. Good question. Okay. How's that screen share work? Can everyone see?
Yes.
All right. Yeah. So the school to prison pipeline of EdTech. A little bit about myself. I know I got an introduction. Thank you very much for that. I just want to add my pronouns are he, him, his. You can follow me on Twitter at Shea Swauger. I'll follow you back. It's where I do most of my online engagement. I'm a librarian and really just excited to be talking with you all. So a little bit of what we're going to go over today. I realized as I was preparing this talk that we need to spend some time on mass incarceration, which is a totally strange place to start conversations around EdTech, but I think that as we get into it, it's really going to contextualize why I think there's this transfer of technology between the criminal justice system and education if we understand mass incarceration more broadly. We'll dig into the school to prison pipeline. That's not something that I coined, that's been around for years. We'll spend most of our time on the prison to school pipeline of EdTech and go through some technologies that have been fluctuating between these two spaces. And then we'll wrap up lastly with why is this happening and what do we do now? Okay, mass incarceration. This is a difficult thing to talk about, and it's definitely something that I'm borrowing from other scholars. And in particular, I would highly recommend a book called The New Jim Crow. So Dr. Michelle Alexander wrote this book. It's been seminal to my understanding of the criminal justice system and in particular criminal justice reform. So do yourself a favor, buy this book, read it. It's definitely impacted how I understand things like education. In it, one of the things that's happening that she describes is something called the war on drugs. And the war on drugs started with this guy. That's President Richard Nixon. And he's kicking off the war on drugs with this speech, sometimes called the Public Enemy #1 speech, where he coins the phrase, America's public enemy #1 is drug abuse. And that essentially changed the landscape of federal funding and priorities, and it launched enormous amounts of money for drug enforcement. It changed how we understand incarceration and criminality. It also started some very famous ad campaigns, like "This is your brain on drugs," kind of spun out of that. The drug abuse resistance education program, was sort of a child of that I grew up in, the DARE program. Behind that is this other guy, and I'm not solid on his pronunciation, but I think it's John Ehrlichman. He's an advisor to the president, and he was one of the architects of the war on drugs. And this guy gave an interview way after the fact in 1996. And I know it's kind of a long quote. I'm going to read it out. Just stick with me. So he says, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Blacks, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Black with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. That's a very powerful statement to me. It is essentially an admission that the war on drugs had nothing to do with drugs. It had to do with trying to criminalize and vilify people that the administration found inconvenient, and it was incredibly effective. So if we think about the war on drugs in terms of combating drug use or the presence of drugs in America, it has been a total failure. Drug consumption today is about the same as it was before the war on drugs started, and it hasn't really fluctuated very much. It has, however, incarcerated the populations they were targeting. So the war on drugs started like roughly 1970, 1971. So if you see on the screen, the population of state and federal prisons exploded after that because of this war on drug campaign. So the graph stops at 2014, but the trend continues to increase in terms of population. Some of the outcomes of the war on drugs, and definitely not all, but are that the Black Americans are far more likely to be arrested for drugs. And that's due to a lot of factors, but like one example is like stop and frisk. That was an institute that gave latitude to police officers to stop and frisk anyone they thought to be engaging in maybe suspicious activity, and it's big scare quotes. And it was very much targeted towards Black men and men of color. And that introduces them into the criminal justice system. The war on drugs changed mandatory minimum sentencing for drug crime, and in particular, drugs that people of color were more likely to use. So we see a huge disparate sentence for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, because we see a racial difference between who uses what. And Black people tended to use crack cocaine more often than white people. And so the minimum sentence for that particular drug was much higher. And so it wasn't about drugs, it was about Black people versus white people. Black people got longer sentences than white people for the same crimes. A big part of that was the discretion of prosecutors and how to get sentences the way that they wanted to. And again, states that didn't increase or in fact cut incarceration didn't have increases in crime. So this is not about crime. A big thing that I wanted to talk about is felon disenfranchisement laws, essentially voting. So if you're a felon, there's laws that say that you no longer have the right to vote. But if we can determine discriminatorily who is a felon, then we can essentially take away the right to vote for people that we don't want to be voting. So let's see. Florida is definitely in the middle of this. There was I think it was a ballot, or I'm not sure it was a ballot or a law that passed trying to give felons the right to vote. And in Florida, that essentially would significantly shift the demographics of the electorate. So there's like, I think 1.2, 1.6 million Black felons in Florida that would be given this new right to vote. And the state of Florida doesn't have like a huge majority for voting. Like I think Bush won and by 534 votes, Trump won by less than the amount of Black people that would be eligible. And Black people tend to vote Democrat. Not always, but there's generally a shift. And so the GOP and the Republican Party fought significantly to make this law not happen. And so it's still being adjudicated now. And so, and again, this is not just a Republican thing. Both Democrat and Republican administrations have engaged in felon disenfranchisement and mass incarceration. So they're equally responsible. All right. So that is a very quick overview of mass incarceration. But Dr. Michelle Alexander summarizes this in a way that says that the US criminal justice system functions as a contemporary system for racial control. So we had Jim Crow laws that functioned as such, but when they went away, racism had to kind of reinvent itself. And so mass incarceration became sort of the replacement. So bundle that up, and we're going to say that that is the foundation, or the first foundational claim for the prison to school pipeline. We're going to be building on that, that first claim. So we'll come back to that claim. We're going to move on to the school to prison pipeline. So the African American Policy Forum defines this pipeline as the interaction of national, state, and local policies and practices that serve to push young people, disproportionately youth of color, out of schools and into the criminal justice system. And again, thinking back to Alexander's definition, the criminal justice system as a system for racial control. So this comic demonstrates, I mean, it's pretty aggressive, but nonetheless, on the left side, we have public education, a generally underfunded enterprise that is pushing students and vulnerable students into the prison industrial complex. And the prison industry is very well funded. There is so much money in that system. So a few elements of the prison to, or the school to prison pipeline. If you've ever heard of zero tolerance policies, essentially it's, it constricts the amount of responses you have as either a teacher or a school administrator to deal with behavioral issues. And usually requires police to intervene more often for minor events. So, I mean, I grew up with a school resource officer in my school starting in elementary, and that was just something I took for granted. I thought all schools had cops. That was very normal. And the cops were called for students that had either behavioral issues or any kind of truancy or minor offenses that normally would be handled outside of the criminal justice system. It's very important to note that discipline in schools significantly impacts Black students and students of color far more than white students. So Black girls are particularly vulnerable. They are 6 times more likely to get suspended than white girls, and same with Black boys. Excuse me. I'm not going to show any sort of violence or videos of that happening. That is very much on the internet, not something I wanted to further, but there's so many examples of what this looks like. So on the left side, we see a video of a 6-year-old crying as she's being arrested because I honestly, I don't even know if they define what sort of the disturbance was, but it does not constitute arrest under any circumstances. And Black girls, again, are very much more vulnerable to this kind of intervention. So the school, oh yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, but
oh, please.
One of our participants has a question and has raised
Yeah.
her hand, and I didn't know if you wanted to wait till the end or if you want to pause to answer.
No, let's jump into it.
I'm gonna.
All right. So which question?
We that person to talk. Doug, go ahead and ask your question. And you should be able to unmute. Let's see. I'll unmute you. See if that'll work. Doug, you still there with your question? Not sure if he'll be. I'm not able to unmute him.
Okay.
Well, we'll try to grab his question and we'll get it to you somehow.
That's all right. I've got the chat open now, so if we want to throw it in there, that's
okay.
Good too.
Doug,
all
if
right.
you could put your question in there, that'd be great.
Mm-hmm. Oh, someone threw out the documentary 13th as a resource. Definitely agree with that. That's wonderful. All right. So foundational claim, second one, is that the prison to, oh yeah, that should be the school to prison pipeline in that one. First typo, yes. So yes, the second one is that the school to prison pipeline pushes students of color into the criminal justice system. All right, now we're getting into EdTech. So,
And oh, Shay, I was just going to interrupt because Stacy
yeah.
did have a question for you real quick. Do school resource officers have criminal repercussions? I was under the impression that they were just community resources, but I'm privileged, so there's a lot of things I don't normally see.
That's a great question. I don't know a ton of studies specifically on school resource officers if there's criminal repercussions. In general, police officers rarely have any kind of criminal repercussions. So see, Greg is saying yes, they do. If you have a link, I would love to dig into that. I know that there have been officers that have been fired or that have to be redirected or taken out of school systems. It's incredibly difficult to prosecute a police officer. Even police officers that have killed people and been found that that killing is not justified, there's usually not disciplinary reactions from the department. So yeah, SROs can arrest. A school resource officer is definitely just, it's a cop. They have all the same authority as every other cop in any other circumstance. They're not always armed the same. Sometimes they are, depends on their circumstance. All right. Keep sending those questions in. I appreciate it.
We actually have one more.
Let's do it.
This might be one that well, first of all, I think everybody who knows anything in chat that would like to respond to it would be great. And this might be one that also might get answered later on in your presentation, because I know you're doing some setup right now. But here's a question from Anne. As an educator and a restorative justice coordinator in the minority in a minority setting, how do I help my students know and understand that they are valuable and can change their destinies? I believe it's a mentality issue.
That's a really hard question, and it's definitely complicated. I think saying those things definitely help. I might disagree that it's a mentality issue. I would say that there are structural barriers that are in place for vulnerable and minoritized students and students of color that are not in place for other students that have enormous privilege. And so we're going to be describing some of what those structural barriers are. And so I don't want to put the onus on the students to try to change their destinies when the landscape of what their future looks like is so different than their peers who have privilege. That essentially to me is like, if they fail to change their destiny, I don't want that responsibility to feel like it's on them, when I think that should be a social responsibility that we all have to make sure everyone's future could be successful, depending on how you want to define what that means. So I don't know what to tell those students. Like, what I'm trying to do is tear down the policies and structures that are actually causing the harm in the first place, so that they do have a chance. But I don't know if saying that they have the responsibility, and maybe I'm misinterpreting the question, but I would say it's less of a mentality issue and more what are the allocated resources and opportunities given to people? And I don't think it's equal across all demographics.
And
I
think,
yeah, go for it.
I was going to say, and I think that is that's such an impactful statement that I think that we can continue to discuss it in chat.
Okay, cool. And we can also dig back into it afterwards when we're all done. Awesome. All right, so EdTech. I'm going to break it into two categories, high EdTech and low EdTech. There might be better words for that. If anyone has them, please throw it at me. So I think we in education circles, we typically talk about EdTech in the high sense. Like, I'm listing some examples of AI, learning analytics, facial recognition. But I think low tech is either as important or maybe more important when we talk about technology. So I listed pencils, paper, whiteboards, desks. The general infrastructure of education is also a technology. And those technologies are far more common. And I think that the criminal justice system has been importing both in high tech and in low tech. And so I'm going to start talking about the low tech forms of criminal justice technology. So we're going to go over bulletproof glass and backpacks, guns, isolation rooms, metal detectors, electric shock devices, and technology is contraband. We won't actually discuss that, but have you ever seen laptop bans, cell phone bans in classrooms? I mean, that's sort of an extension. Like a cell phone in prison is considered contraband. There's significant punishment that happens if you have that. We have a less severe form of that happening in the classroom. All right, bulletproof glass. So school safety is actually a very personal topic for me. When I was preparing for this, there's several points I got emotional. I was in 7th grade when the Columbine shooting happened, just a couple miles from my house. It was very much part of my community. I knew some of the victims' families. And so when we talk about school shooting, this is definitely hitting home for me. My daughter goes to Littleton Public Schools. I remember going to one of the school board election, sort of get to know your candidate. And one of the candidates running for school board at Littleton Public Schools, her main platform was, let's make all the glass in all the schools bulletproof. And there was it comes from this place of, we've had school shootings in the past. We had one more recently at Arapahoe High School. And so, and it's a way to sidestep the gun control debate. It's not like, let's talk about why we have, access to firearms in the way that we do with the, lax security that we do. It sidesteps that and says, let's lock down schools. Let's do something about it. And so companies that make these kind of products, they make a lot of money and they work with a lot of school districts, and our school district in particular is predisposed to those kinds of responses. But bulletproof glass, that isn't invented in education. That was invented in law enforcement and military. That technology is not native to education. Same with bulletproof backpacks. This is a heartbreaking form of technology that parents who are worried about their children's ability to survive a school shooting, they can buy their kids fucking bulletproof backpacks. And it breaks my heart that is where we're at in terms of, let's again sidestep the responsibility we have as a country to actually enforce or create sensible gun reform. Here you go, child of mine, here's a backpack that might save your life. And again, bulletproof technology did not originate in education, it originated in law enforcement. Another technology is guns. So, I mean, guns didn't come specifically from law enforcement, but the idea that in an institutionalized setting, a person of authority who's supposed to be in charge of other people should be armed, that is a law enforcement idea. That comes from police and from prisons. That prison guards are armed and prisoners are not. And a lot of people, disturbingly, in the United States think that it's a good idea to arm teachers. And on the right, it's from the NRA, so of course they think that arming teachers is good. But lots of state legislators are trying to experiment with what it means to arm teachers. And the fact that the President of the United States floated the idea of arming teachers is incredibly upsetting. Gonna jump into isolation rooms. So this is a piece by ProPublica that I highly recommend called The Quiet Rooms. And it is what it sounds like. It is a form of solitary confinement that we put children into when they are misbehaving or not conforming to what our ideas of a student should be. And it's a controversial practice, but it is incredibly common. And so you can put a student in this. There's no regulations around what the room is supposed to be, if it's supposed to be patterned or not, how big it's supposed to be, how long they're supposed to be in there. And it is, so solitary confinement in prisons is incredibly inhumane, and the psychological and emotional impact and damage it does on fully formed adults is documented in a form of torture. We are doing the same practice with children. and the impact is horrible. So here's a couple of follow-up pieces from children that they give to kids. So on the left side, a child who was a 7-year-old girl was secluded, and she had to fill out that she felt sad and angry and frightened. And then when she was in the quiet room, she kept thinking that she needed help, and she kept thinking that she needed not to die. And on the right, it's a student writing after they spent 40 minutes in seclusion, that she said that I will follow directions, I will follow directions, I will follow directions, because she was terrified of going back into the quiet rooms. So this is a very brutal form of carceral technology being used and adapted in an education setting to children. All right, metal detectors. These have been around for decades. I don't actually know how long. I mean, it's not all schools. It's usually poor school districts, communities of color, so it's definitely disproportional in its impact. But again, this was invented by law enforcement that's being transitioned into education. This is also disturbing. These are electric shock devices. So on the left side, you see that county jails and prisons allow the use of electric shock devices on inmates. And as recently, I think it was last month, I think it was March, that the FDA had to create a national ban of electric shock devices in schools, because there was actually one specific school district that was using it on students with disabilities. And they were using it as a form of like behavioral modification, and it was straight up torture. It is horrific, but nonetheless, the idea that there was a school district that thought, all right, electric shock device made by a prison company can be used on our most vulnerable students. That's what we want to do with. It's an extreme example, but nonetheless, all of these in some ways are borrowing this idea that what is okay for prisoners is okay for students. Okay. That was low tech. That's some rough stuff. So thank you for sticking with me. We're gonna go into the high ed tech in law enforcement. So using cell phones to track locations, social media, account monitoring, learning analytics, artificial intelligence, facial recognition. This is more what we think of when it comes to EdTech. And so the EdTech conferences that I go to, it's kind of like, here's the cutting edge, innovative things that we're doing to disrupt schools. And I'm gesticulating like I'm mocking it, because I kind of am. I want to be careful, because there is some good stuff out there, but there's just so much shit out there that it's hard for me to be excited about what the innovative things are. So let's dive in. All right, cell phone location tracking. This was definitely invented from a defense and policing agencies. This is not native to education. The technology is usually called Stingray, and that's a very it's a very expensive piece of equipment, and it's actually not available to people outside of law enforcement. But the premise is the same: is that some form of technology can track the location of people using cell phones, and it can intercept calls, it can listen in, it can gather metadata. It's used largely with police departments, like the LAPD is a very prominent user of Stingrays, and it's targeted against poor communities and communities of color. Also, protests are pretty common. And so education looked at that and said, yeah, let's do that. That is a great idea. So it's again, slightly different technology. It's not Stingray. But here's a couple articles that are unpacking ways that higher education in particular are trying to track students' phones to their location, of how they move around campus, where they are they attending class. I think UNC Chapel Hill had a really interesting example of trying to take attendance, and in particular with their student athletes, which they've had trouble with for a number of years in terms of the amount of control they want to exert over student athletes, and there's a huge amount of surveillance happening with students. So another technology we'll go into is social media monitoring. And ever since the rise of social media, the Defense Department and police have been trying to use it to monitor people on it. So ICE uses it to try to arrest undocumented immigrants. The Department of Homeland Security tries to use it to identify threats to national security. And when you're working at that kind of scale, you can't just have people scrolling through feeds hoping to read the right things or follow the right people. It usually has to be automated. And so they develop usually AI that sorts through an enormous amount of social media traffic and pulls out things that are either keywords or phrases or rhetorical sound bites that the AI has identified as being, something they want to flag. Education's like, yes, let's get in on that. But instead of national security or undocumented immigrants, let's do it for protecting against the next school shooting. You'll see a theme here that schools have this fear that they want to protect against school shootings or student safety. And so they'll invest in the technology to do it. So the main argument I hear from schools that are using this is for mental health, that they want to identify before anything happens, either self-harm or harm to others. And so the intention itself is good. Like yes, let's identify self-harm and harm to others before there's harm at all. However, a lot of these systems, because they're using AI to flag what is suspicious, there's a lot of discrepancy in how white speech and black speech happens online and how an AI is going to code how black people speak online is more aggressive. And so there's a few studies that come out that AI trying to say who is going to be an active harmer, it thinks that white people are less likely than black people just because of their speech patterns, because it was trained on white speech as the normal. And so there's a lot of racial disparity in how these kinds of programs can operate. All right, predictive analytics. In the same way that I plugged The New Jim Crow, I would also plug this book, The Rise of Big Data Policing. Andrew Guthrie Ferguson is an incredible scholar, and I would highly recommend reading this book. It's definitely shaped how I understand policing and criminal justice when it comes to things like predictive analytics. It's bad. I could spend the whole other presentation on saying why this is bad, but it's essentially trying to predict, using police data, who is likely to be a criminal or where crime is going to happen. Those are the main ones. And I said that this is using police data, not like general data. And the problem is that when you use police data to try to predict crime, to change where law enforcement goes, it becomes a self-reinforcing prophecy. And so when you already have the over-policing of communities of color, most of your data around who's a criminal and where arrest happens are going to be in those communities. So then when you look back at the data around where the crime is happening, oh, it's in the communities of color, let's go back. And then the cycle starts over again. And so you're going to have models that disproportionately predict that Black people are going to be criminals and that poorer communities are going to be where crime happens. However, education's like, yes, that is the answer. We want to use predictive analytics, but instead of crime, let's see who's going to succeed in education or not. So we're not predicting criminality, we're predicting lack of success. Spoiler alert, a lot of the demographics that come with what the previous models defined as criminality also predict you as not succeeding in college. So what these things are actually predicting is privilege or lack of privilege. So things like your GPA, like your zip code, your socioeconomic status, those are going to be predictors on whether or not you do well in school, but they're also predictors of privilege. And so, and also in education, we don't usually say predictive analytics, we usually say learning analytics. Oh yeah, we got some pre-crime in the chat. That is 100% what it is. Also, full disclosure, like I work for the University of Colorado, Denver. We are using a learning analytics platform from a company called EAB. This is pretty common. This is also happening in enrollment and admissions offices. They're trying to figure out which students do we go after, which ones are likely to be able to afford the college and pay the tuition, and then also succeed. And let's go after those students. And let's not waste our time on students that maybe not succeed, so we'll have more bang for our buck. And that's becoming a more common practice. Okay. So criminal justice AI. So for policing agencies, there's definitely a lot of data that they've been using predictive analytics for a while. It started with a program called CompStat, but it's difficult to say when the outputs of those programs come up, how do we then make decisions and allocate resources? That's when the AI products come in on top of that, trying to say, all right, we need to send 4 cops to this location during these times. That's when the AI starts making decisions. But there's also other kinds of AI that's being used for things like probation or sentencing. So it's going to take data around trying to define how much of a risk you are. So if we're, as a court, imagine we're the criminal justice system, making smart decisions around who's a flight risk, who is going to skip bail and not come back. Let's set your bond higher. But in order to know if you're a risk, we're going to track the data that we have on you in our criminal justice databases, and that's going to produce a score. And that score will be then sent to the judge to recommend, when you set your bail at $10,000 versus $20,000 versus $10. Or you're up for probation, and let's gather the data we have on you and see how much of a risk we think you are. And all of these algorithms have gone under scrutiny and shown to have a racial bias. And it's very, very consistent across the board from multiple sources. However, education is like, yes, AI is the answer. I'm sure what happened in criminal justice won't happen in the classroom because reasons. So there's a lot of AI startups that are trying to disrupt the classroom or revolutionize teaching. I can't go into all of them, but they're mostly all bad. I've yet to see any AI that has actually delivered on the promises that it said. Also, the branding on this is very interesting. That they usually say that they're going to have a personalized learning experience. So that is usually code for some kind of AI trying to say that each student is different, and on their individualized journeys, we should give them a personalized experience like Starbucks or some shit like that. And it is usually just an algorithm that is given insufficient data and some parameters that worked in maybe another school district that they're trying to use an enterprise software to launch on scale. And the cost for them as a company is very low, but the cost for students, if they get it wrong, is incredibly high. So don't ever use these. Criminal justice, facial recognition. This is, of all the technologies that I've discussed, facial recognition, I think, is by far the most problematic in terms of its potential consequences. Facial recognition is incredibly inaccurate. It is racist, it is transphobic, it misgenders people all the time. It's bad. And law enforcement has been using it a lot. So ICE uses it sometimes legally, sometimes illegally, and there are court cases still litigating at this point, trying to define, when it is or isn't legal. The City of London is going into real-time facial recognition. That's different than after the fact, and that's far more problematic. But education sees this as, this is a way for us to keep schools safe. Again, this is going back to the bulletproof glass. This is going into predictive analytics. But if I'm a school system, and again, I don't want to have the gun debate, but I want to keep schools safe and I want to feel like I'm doing something, let's say we put a facial recognition system in the front of our buildings. And so that only students, staff, and maybe parents who've been approved can be let in. That sidesteps the reality is that most active shooters are students, staff, or parents. It's the people that are already in the system that are more likely to be active harmers than people outside of the system. In the meantime, you've set up a system that will probably misidentify students of color, because facial recognition is incredibly problematic and negligent when it comes to race. But school systems are buying these. Out of all the technologies, I think this one is still a little slow on the uptake. I'm hoping it goes away entirely, but I know that there are school systems that are adopting facial recognition as a building access for seen as a safety feature. All right. So the foundational claim that I'm making, hopefully, is that I think there is a revolving door of people and technology between education and the criminal justice system. So the school to prison pipeline is pushing people from education into the criminal justice system. And the prison to school pipeline is taking technologies and almost like pedagogical approaches from like prisons and law enforcement and putting them in the classroom. So if we take A, B, and C together, that the US criminal justice system functions as a contemporary system of racial control, that the prison to school pipeline pushes students of color into the criminal justice system, and that there is a revolving door of people and technology between education and the criminal justice system, I think that's where we arrive at the prison to school pipeline of EdTech. You have to sort of build the three in order to get to the fourth. Okay, why? And I don't know. Like that's my big reveal. Like that's it. Like, why is this happening? I don't know, and I wish I did. And I feel like it's my responsibility as a keynote to have answers. And the truth is, I really don't. I have some guesses, and I want to walk through those with you. So I see some parallels between criminal justice and I see with education. So both criminal justice and education operate with white supremacy. And I use that term specifically instead of racism. Some people feel more comfortable with racism. White supremacy is a form of racism. You can have racism between communities of color. That happens all the time. But at least in the American education system and the American criminal justice system, it is specifically white supremacy that's operating behind the scenes. The criminal justice system is all about surveillance, and I feel like education is catching up on that. It didn't used to be as surveillance heavy, and I think it's getting there. So here's when some of the pedagogical approaches and philosophical commitments in the criminal justice system and education start to line up. So there's lots of theories of why criminal justice is what it is. I think a major one is that it sees criminals as broken, or that they need rehabilitation. And so if a criminal is caught and then put into the prison system and put on parole, that they are somehow fixed or rehabilitated so they are less likely to engage in crime. We know that's not the case, but nonetheless, that's sort of like the underlying commitment or philosophy. The other one is like they're paying a debt to society, which is also bullshit. But nonetheless, it's still seen as like a deficit that is either a broken person or they owe something. It is this negative space, this vacuum that requires filling or fixing. That is not unlike certain pedagogical approaches to students, that students are an empty cabinet, a blank slate, and the banking model of education that students are lacking and that education gives them something. And so I think that the way our society approaches or understands criminals or criminality is similar to how some people are approaching students in education. Now, there is enormous variance in how people that operate in the criminal justice system understand criminals, and variance between how certain teachers understand education. There are amazing teachers that are trying to work with pedagogies of liberation and agency. But I think there's a majority of teachers that are still operating in banking model. I think both the criminal justice system and education are, so some people think that criminal justice is trying to reintegrate criminals back into society. And I know there's a lot of people in education that think that education is about preparing students for the job market to participate in capitalism. I don't think that. I think it's a terrible reason to say why education exists. But I know that there are prominent people and heads of schools and universities that think that it's to try to job prep our students. But both of those commitments hold prisons and schools outside of society. That like when you're locked up, when you get back to society, that's the real world. And then when you're in education, that's not the real world. And I know lots of parents and teachers have said, like, you know, that's not how the real world works. And that when you actually get into the real world, it works like this. And the real world is, again, is the economy, it's capitalism. So I think they have these commitments that schools and prisons are outside of society and the real society is actually the marketplace. So these are guesses. Again, like I'm going to be spending years unpacking what this question means. Why is there a prison to school pipeline of EdTech? Why do we think that what works for prisoners should work with students? It will be years. And I will probably give more talks and write more papers. And I would love your input on maybe reasons why you think there is this interplay between these two systems. I should also say, like, I'm a prison abolitionist. I don't think that prisons should exist in the way that they do now. I think the entire system needs to be dismantled. I don't feel like that about education. I think education needs to be radically reformed. But I think that in general, when we speak about them, I don't want to just change both. I actually want to get rid of one and then change the other. Okay, so what do we do about it? Yeah, I don't know that either. This is really hard.
I think we all understand that, and we have a question.
Yeah.
We have a question in there. I'm going to go back to it. What about closing the loop? Does providing education in prisons worsen this pipeline? Does it pose new problems or different issues? Some research shows education programs reduce recidivism rates, but should that be the aim? And we even have, how do we even close the loop?
Yeah.
So those are the kind of questions showing up.
So this is a great question. I would say I feel both things. One, yes, I think prisons should be abolished. I don't think they should, we should tear them down. We should have entirely different systems of dealing with the systems that produce criminals in the first place. But to the question of what do we do right now? Like right now, there are education programs offered in prisons. I think those are good things. There's a guy named DeRay McKesson. He's an activist and author. He wrote a book which the name escapes me. I can reference it later. But he talks about this tension of wanting to radically change systems and incremental improvement. And I'm in the radically change systems camp, but yes, there can be incremental improvement. And providing education to prisoners does reduce recidivism. It can be very fulfilling. One of my favorite Twitter followers, Clint Smith, he works in prisons all the time. And he works on liberation-based pedagogy and teaches prisoners how to write and how to speak and do poetry. And it's incredible work. So yes, I do think that there could be changes made to the criminal justice system in terms of education that should be offered. But ultimately, my goal is not to just improve and tweak. My goal is to radically dismantle the system that's built on white supremacy and racial control. So I hope that answers your question. It's kind of like, yes, it should get better, but ultimately I want it to go away. In this slide, so I hope it's implicit that when I say I don't know what to do about it, that the minimum we can do about it is don't use these technologies. Like, we should never, ever use isolation rooms for children, ever. We should never use shock therapy. We should not be tracking them with cell phones. We shouldn't be using facial recognition, period, under any circumstances. But that's not enough. It is merely not participating in the system is not the same as dismantling it. And my goal is dismantling it, but I don't know how to do that until I know why it's functioning the way it is, how it got here. And so when I say, like, how did this happen? I don't know. Once I feel like I understand more of how this got created and how it's functioning, who the actors are and how the system works, then I think we'll have a more robust answer to what we do about it now. Because the answer isn't just, don't buy it. I think we shouldn't buy it. I'm working at my institution to try to disinvest from enterprise software systems that I think are participating in this pipeline. But that's fighting the symptoms. That's not fighting the problem. There's an underlying problem that's creating a market for those kinds of technologies. And that's what we haven't diagnosed yet. And hopefully when we understand that better, I'll have a different slide besides, I don't know that either, but that's all I got right now. So I do want to leave you with something a little bit more positive than I am void of information about how to do something. And that's Bell Hooks, and her work is also very influential to me, is that the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy. there's a huge struggle of trying to define what the classroom should be about. And I think it should be about liberation. I think it should be about agency. I think it should be about curiosity and exploration and trying to give students power to live in a society that isn't built for them. And that's what I hope my work does. And I see a number of people and companies operating under the idea that students should be treated like prisoners, and they shouldn't. And so I hope that this talk illuminates some of why that idea is so harmful. But I also want to leave you with some hope that I think that the classroom can be incredibly healthy and productive, and not in like an economic way, but in like fostering the souls of the students that we are given this opportunity to work with. And that agency and liberation and freedom should be at the center of that. And if we make that commitment, then we automatically reject any carceral technology that's being sold to us as disrupting or fixing education. So thank you so much for spending this time with me. I will try to get some slides out as soon as possible. And I think we've got a little bit of time to dig into some questions. So I'm going to stop sharing and we can just talk.
Shea, I want to say thank you so much for being with us. That was great.
Thank you.
We have sessions coming up at 1, but we also have an hour for Q&A with Shea here. And I would love to invite everybody. You are welcome to stay here and stick around and talk with Shea. And if you have somewhere else to go, we understand that as well. I'll try and do a decent job of looking in chat and sharing those, but I know that now you're not presenting, you'll be able to monitor as well. So thank you again.